Hi, guys. Welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Hollenkamp, Amy.
Hey, everybody.
And this is the part dos to our part uno about the histamine mast cell immune stuff. So if you are new to this and you're like, wait, what is a mast cell? What is histamine? Why should I care? Go check out that other episode. It was our episode from last week. That'll be a bit of a primer about like why you should care about mast cells and why you should care about histamine and how prevalent this is as a thing within the world of IBS and SIBO. But that being said, today's focus is more about the nutritional side of managing histamine intolerance. And I have a feeling that we're going to be right in the middle on two kind of polar opposite views. Again, like there's the way that conventional medicine handles the histamine intolerance stuff. And there's like the pervasive thought process in functional medicine and dietetics, maybe to some extent. And then probably we're going to be squat right in the middle again, if I had to guess. But per our usual, care to kick us off, Amy? And then we'll talk histamine and food.
Yeah, I think we need to like figure out a name for us, like the middle women or something. Because I do think that you're exactly right that we tend to go in the middle, but I don't like that.
I don't know if I'm jiving with middle women. It makes us sound like it's a lazy way of saying middle-aged women.
Oh, okay.
Or something.
I get what you're saying.
We'll think of something. We'll think of something.
Maybe, yeah, we need to find like some term. But I think you're exactly right. I tend to be in the middle, and I think you do too. Because with histamine, I feel like the second you bring up histamine, sometimes what I find with my clients is they've like maybe read a little bit about it, but I almost think like some of the more extreme histamine diets are more restrictive than low FODMAP, and like some of the restrictive diets for SIBO and IBS. And if you're already restricting certain foods and then you're like trying to deal with histamines on top of that, I think it can be really overwhelming. And
yeah,
again, there's so many different foods that have histamine in them, and it's such a spectrum. So yeah, I mean, typically for me, it's trying to find a middle area and thinking of histamine as a load issue versus trying to eliminate all histamines. So
bingo.
I think, again, you're going to have some histamine in the foods you're eating, but if you can kind of manage the load that you're taking in, and your load might be different, like the amount that you can handle dietarily might be different than another person's, which is also important to recognize. But I think it all comes down to managing the histamine load versus trying to have complete elimination of histamine foods.
Yeah. And I think like you hit on something really important, is that your response to histamine and your like tolerance for it is going to be different from anybody else's. Yeah. And that gets really tricky where you have this world that we live in where everybody is in like a million Facebook groups, and there are groups for histamine, and I think there are groups for like histamine / low FODMAP or histamine AIP, and like there's all sorts of combinations. But you get in these groups where the bias is that everybody in the group is demonizing histamine and making it out to be like the biggest thing in the whole universe, which for some people it is, to be clear. Like I'm not judging this. I work with mast cell patients a lot. It's just that like you get into a group where there is going to be a bias that a lot of their recommendations and a lot of the discussion is going to revolve around histamine. And then also you're going to be more prone to thinking, oh my God, everybody has a histamine issue and it's all really severe and like all histamine is evil, because there's so much focus in these groups typically on restricting the bad thing, in this case, histamine. So, everybody in those groups is going to be different. Everybody, in like a support group, or I don't even know, like where else you would interact with these people. But like, just because Sarah can't touch a tomato with a 10-foot pole doesn't mean that she's always going to be like that, for one. And B, it doesn't mean that you are going to be like that. It might be that you have a little bit more tolerance or wiggle room than that individual does. So bear in mind that this is a very individualized response and a very unique journey that you're on.
Right. And I think it's really important to recognize too, and we talk about this in terms of like low FODMAP, where restricting certain fibers could potentially be helpful short term to minimize symptoms. And I think histamine is similar in that usually there's a lot of other, like your body's producing histamines and releasing histamines. It's not just the histamines from the food that you're getting. So again, it's one aspect of the load that you can help suppress with dietary changes. But there's this whole other area that might be the primary reason of why your histamine's high. It's typically, I would say typically it's not necessarily that your diet's like super high in histamines and you have to cut it back because it's high in histamines, but rather it's that your load's high from other sources as well. And so if you can get your body's production of histamines lower, then your tolerance and your load from foods can be higher. So I think it's always important too to not just see managing histamines as a food strategy. It should be about really trying to, like we were talking about last time, stabilize mast cells and reduce kind of the production of and release of histamine, not just trying to reduce the histamine from the diet.
Yeah. And I think that that's a valid point. It's like, I would actually argue that I think a diet that's high in histamine is never a root cause, truly.
Right.
Like, theoretically, most people, I think, should be able to tolerate histamine in their food. It's just that we have these protective mechanisms, right? It's kind of like low FODMAP and SIBO. It's like, normally you have the stomach acid and the motility and the microbiota to handle that fiber and move it through your system so you don't get an excess of gas production. And if one of those protective mechanisms fail, then FODMAPs can cause symptoms for you because you have SIBO, more than likely.
Right.
And it's like the same thing. It's like incoming dietary histamine shouldn't be a problem. We have the equipment to deal with that, but we have a lot of checks and balances and protective measures that stand between you and a histamine burden. So it's like, where is that protective mechanism failing you? Or are there multiple? Is it that, and this one's really fascinating, but frankly, we don't know a ton about it. We know that some bacteria produce histamine, and we know some bacteria degrade it. And maybe your dysbiosis is part of that picture. Maybe you have more histamine producers and fewer degraders. I don't think we have really clear data on like what species particularly to look at on stool testing, or even if we can measure this in stool testing. But like as a general kind of thing to be aware of, we know that that's a thing. So it could be that dysbiosis is the driving factor. It could be that you have leaky gut and you can't produce the enzyme DAO that breaks down histamine, like we talked about that last time. It could be that your immune system is off its rocker and your immune system is churning out bucket loads of its own histamine, and then like the little tiniest amount from the outside world, and your body just goes, I hate you all. And it's like, you've got to kind of pick through all these root causes and figure out where the stress is on your body so that you can eventually increase your tolerance. Because being on a low histamine diet for the rest of your life is probably not, A, where people want to be, but B, it's not necessarily the full root cause deal.
Right.
Because restricting your diet at all is always going to have consequences. Now, even if you're trying to make sure that you're getting all of your vitamins and minerals and fiber and you're nutritionally replete, like, variety keeps the microbiome healthy and diverse. And if you whittle down your potential list of foods that you could consume by a moderate amount, I mean, you are going to get less diversity in your gut microbiota over time doing that. So you don't necessarily want to stay on a low histamine diet forever and ever, unless you have a very compelling reason, like overt mast cell disease. Then maybe I would go there.
Right.
But ideally, you want to increase your tolerance so that you can add back in some of the histamine foods.
Right. And I think it's such a good point to, and I see this with low FODMAP too. It's like when the focus becomes about diet restriction and not about sort of the root causal approaches, I think there can be a balance where, like, okay, you might want to take some of these high histamine foods off the table just to kind of calm things down so you can help with the root causal issues and just kind of calm symptoms down. But I think what happens a lot of the times is that there's so much emphasis on the diet side of things and so much less emphasis on balancing out the underlying factors that people are kind of stuck on lower histamine for long periods of time and they get stuck in that rut. So I think we're making a lot of good points that be careful of where you're investing your energy in from a histamine standpoint. And that could be said with low FODMAP too. And just always kind of keep your eye on like, okay, this isn't necessarily something to lean on forever in most cases, unless again it's a severe like overt disease state. So I just think it's always important to recognize if too much energy is being pulled on the diet side of things and not enough energy on actually digging deeper. And just working with people in the SIBO space, like I see that all the time with the SIBO diets and low FODMAP diets. It's the same thing can be said with histamine diets too. And again, like I said, restricting some histamines to take the load off is key, but really making sure that like keeping your eye on digging deeper is really important.
Yeah, you always want to get to the root causes or at least understand them. Right. I mean, sometimes you can't go back in time and undo a root cause. Right? So like if you have SIBO that's driving the histamine intolerance and your root cause of SIBO was food poisoning, we can't wave a magic wand, go back to 1992 and tell you not to go to that seafood restaurant in San Francisco. Like we can't do that. But you can try to understand what that root cause did to your body and help it so that it can heal to the best of its ability. Like if you got food poisoning, okay, you really, really, really need to be on a prokinetic. Right. Like that's huge. And like you need to be treating your situation as though it was an autoimmune disease because it probably is an autoimmune process. And like you need to be mindful of vitamin D. And, you know, it's like, even if you can't undo the root cause, you could try to understand it and then you could try to move forward with that information so that you can eventually overcome the SIBO and then deal with the histamine intolerance and try to work on that to the best of your ability. So, I mean, sometimes it's easier said than done. It could take months or years, but knowing is half the battle. Like, just have an eye out for that sort of stuff and kind of never give up and keep plugging away at it, I guess, would be the point.
Yeah, 100%. So, when you're working with someone and there's like a histamine situation, whether like they've already been on some restricting some histamine and know it's an issue, or you're kind of thinking that it is, what's like your first step from a dietary standpoint with someone that you suspect has histamine issues?
Yeah, so I guess like I'll play a for instance, like if I have a patient for whom I'm highly suspicious of a histamine issue, but it's not yet been proven, usually I'll have them do an experiment and restrict the highest histamine foods. So like, you know, fermented foods, you know, things like soy sauces, tomatoes, vinegar. I'll have them restrict those highest histamine foods for like a week or two and then report back. And sometimes when I have people do that, even just doing that much, people are like, whoa, that's a notable difference. Right. Sometimes it's less convincing. Like if somebody does that degree of restriction for about 2 weeks, comes back and says, yeah, no, seeing a big difference, then we'll kind of have and haw over the merit of that and like, okay, maybe you don't have a histamine issue. Maybe it's a little bit more subclinical. Maybe we should do some testing and try to confirm if this is even a thing. Maybe we should test for leaky gut. Like we'll kind of figure out if it's something we want to tackle in that moment. For the people who come back and they're like, wow, yeah, that made a difference. Then I'm like, okay, great. Now here's the full list of things to be mindful of like, you know, high, medium, low histamine foods. Try to choose from the medium and the low list when you can and try to minimize the higher histamine stuff to the best of your ability, at least for a couple of months. And then I always give people a handout to go with that. That is an anti-histamine food list. And it's foods that have like quercetin and luteolin and vitamin C and things that can help kind of drain the histamine bucket more quickly. And that way they could work on the additions and the subtractions at the same time. So that's how I would typically approach it if there's no like confirmed mast cell disease or confirmed histamine issue.
Yeah, no, I think, I'm pretty similar as well in terms of my approach of, trying to get the heavy hitters off the table and just seeing how someone responds, I think is key. Sometimes too, like if someone comes to me and they're saying like, oh, I just like have a terrible reaction to ferments, things like that. Like if there's some obvious things, sometimes that leads me to want to experiment a little bit deeper. But
like
yeah,
I get reflux every time I have tomato sauce.
Right.
I'm like, ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting too that like a lot of the high histamine foods are the reflux foods too.
Well, they'll show up on the acid list, like, because in conventional medicine, bless their hearts, they'll give patients this list. It's like, avoid these acidic foods. And what is it? Vinegar, citrus, tomato sauce. And I'm like, well, yeah, they might be acidic, but they're also really high histamine foods.
Right.
So which is it? I think it's probably more of a histamine thing. And it's just like they're accidentally getting something right.
Right.
Honestly, is what it ends up being. Like, it's a whoops, but they end up being correct for a different reason, which is kind of beautiful.
Right. I'd rather it be a whoops and them getting it right than a whoops.
Yeah.
And them getting it wrong. So
yeah, and I don't even question. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. That works.
Yeah.
And also, here's some other considerations.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty consistent one. I've had a lot of patients who they mention that, like, oh, tomato sauce always gives me reflux. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Let's discuss.
Yeah. No, and I think that, like, we've talked about this in the past, too, and I think we were mentioning at the beginning of this call, like, there's such a spectrum with, like, the load, the histamine load that you can take on. And I find a lot of people do well, kind of what you were saying, avoiding the heavy hitters. I would say it's more the rarity that people have to kind of get much deeper than that. But there's certainly people that do. So typically, again, that's generally my approach of like, if we're going to avoid histamines, I still want to keep your diet as broad as you can possibly tolerate it, with us understanding that there's a histamine issue, and we might want to do some strategies to help dampen that down so that it's not causing inflammation, in that you can tolerate more things. But like what you're saying, there's always the risk and consequence of cutting too much out, being able to actually nourish your body, of being and potentially losing diversity in the microbiome if you get too narrow. Because I've definitely seen people kind of avoiding even low, like even if there's like low levels of histamine in something, and I typically think that's not necessary. And like we've kind of been saying, we tend to be in the middle, and I think in this one we're in the middle because we're managing potential consequences that could happen if you go too far. Yeah. And it's not if it's not necessary.
Well, there's this very real risk, and it's hard to quantify and really like.
Right.
This might be something that's tricky to explain verbally. Normally, this would be the sort of thing that I would bust out like Microsoft Paint, and I would draw a paint picture for a patient if I was on a Zoom call. But try to bear with me. So what can happen, and why I'm concerned with super strict restriction indefinitely for most people. Again, aside, like if you have severe mast cell activation disorder or syndrome, or if you have like mastocytosis, those are the situations where I'm going to be a bit more open-minded to, you just might not be able to eat tomatoes again. Like that, like those really heavy hitters might genuinely be a never again thing for you.
Right.
But maybe we could get some of the like medium or medium high foods back in moderation, even for those people. But what can happen is if you restrict your diet to, let's start with number one. The people who are histamine intolerant and the people who are frankly interested in this episode of the podcast are probably the hyperallergic folk of the world, right? Yeah. So like asthma and eczema and hives and itchiness and mucus and phlegm and sinus problems and food allergies and environmental allergies. And they're just phlegm factories. And I say that with love because I consider myself a little bit of a phlegm factory still. I think I'm on the spectrum of histamine, but I'm like way at the low end. So I don't pay too much attention to it. But acknowledging that this crowd tends to be hyperallergic, that means that their body is more poised and ready to make antibodies to all the things. So like a normal person, like let's just have, for instance, like say that you're a normal person, as if you're a normal person and I'm like a histamine intolerant person, right? So in this situation, we both walk outside the door, we get exposed to the same tree pollen, but my immune system is going to make antibodies to it more readily, and your immune system will go, meh, whatever, it's tree pollen, no big deal. Similarly, we could eat the exact same food. My immune system is more poised and ready to make antibodies against that food in my hyperallergic histaminic state versus a normal person. So what can happen is, as you restrict your diet and as you lose diversity in the microbiota, there's a name for this in research. It's called a loss of tolerance.
Yeah.
And that can manifest different ways, but it's this idea that your immune system starts to lose tolerance to other stuff. And that can be loss of chemical tolerance. So these are the people who like, they walk into an elevator with somebody with perfume on and they immediately get a migraine.
Yeah.
Or they walk into a situation where there's bleach and they immediately get hives. Like the environmental chemical sensitivity people fall under this category, loss of tolerance. The highly allergic people with like a million food sensitivities, food allergies, that falls into it. And also autoimmunity, because you're losing tolerance to self-tissue. You're making antibodies against something that, frankly, you shouldn't make a lot of antibodies against. So it's this slippery slope where, like, the thing that teaches your immune system to be tolerant is the microbiota, and it is that diversity. So if you lose diversity, you're losing that signaling to the immune system, telling the immune system, hey, man, be cool, be chill. Like, we're all cool. I'm cool, you're cool. I'm picturing, like, as a stoner sitting on the couch. Like, we're cool, I'm cool, you're cool. We're all cool. Be cool. Don't overreact. We're all chill, man.
Yeah.
Like, you want your immune system to get that memo every day. But if you lose diversity, you lose that memo. And then your immune system starts to lose tolerance. And now this person who is already hyperallergic to begin with is now going to lose tolerance for the world around them, and their immune system is going to go bonkers and make more antibodies to more weird shit, and then they're finding that they have to restrict their diet more because they lost tolerance to literally everything. And this is how, like, you know, well-intentioned practitioners or well-intentioned people will, you know, discover a thing like histamine, and they fall down the rabbit hole and they read all the blogs and all the podcasts, all the YouTube videos, and they do all the things, and then, you know, they restrict so heavily. And if they stick with that for too long, then they'll find when they try to reintroduce foods, it doesn't go so hot. Or if they're chronically relying on the same handfuls of food, well, now they're finding that even those formerly safe foods aren't so safe for them anymore. And it can snowball out of control and be this big thing because you're losing tolerance. And that's exactly what this crowd needs to avoid, like the freaking plague. The hyperallergic crowd, the histaminic crowd, needs to tell their immune system, hey man, shush, calm down, be cool. And that's a really real risk if you restrict your diet in any circumstances, even if it has merit to doing it, even if you have a strategy around that, it's this give and take situation. So you've got to be careful with how much you restrict and make sure that you're adding one thing for everything that you're restricting, or at least making an effort to do that.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think it's something that has happened with the AIP situation. Like, you see AIP, especially big AIP people, kind of backtracking a little bit and trying to increase variety more and not making it so restrictive. Like, AIP is kind of moving away from forever restricting any food that could potentially be immunogenic, which is basically what AIP is. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that even AIP is kind of recognizing that it's not good to be heavily restrictive, especially if you don't need to be. Mm-hmm. And they've been kind of backtracking, and I wonder if histamine's gonna reach the same, like if some of the histamine groups will start to backtrack. And I think slowly FODMAP is a bit, or at least there's more understanding around, like, oh, this is a temporary tool, or at least I've seen some positive momentum. I hope the same thing happens with histamine too, where
Yeah. I hope
just
so.
understanding that it's a tool, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, diversity is like the one thing that I feel like most people agree on in the gut health space, that diversity is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Compared to any other in-depth view of certain microbiota and things like that. I think the consensus is you want diversity, and diversity is important, and
it's well researched against like every disease on planet Earth. Like good,
exactly,
diverse microbiome, you're protected. Not diverse, you're gonna get whatever the disease is.
Yeah, the consensus is you want a diverse microbiome, but like, if you want a diverse microbiome, it's going to be impossible to do if you're eating kind of a lot of or you're eating pretty restrictively. And I even think like the low FODMAP side of things, I think what happens too, and even in the histamine world, I'm sure this is the case, is once your diet's pretty restrictive and you're already kind of fed up with having these restrictions, and you want, or at least I find that a lot of people want to be able to rely on like, okay, this is my breakfast, this is my lunch. Like they have one or two options that they know are safe, because no one's necessarily worked with them to build variety in or encourage them to kind of build variety in. They've just encouraged them to cut things out.
Yeah.
So I do think a lot of times, even if someone has to go histamine or has to go low FODMAP or has to go or goes AIP for a short period of time, trying to build as much diversity and variety in as you can in the context of what you can tolerate, I think is so key.
Yeah.
But isn't discussed enough and is sort of viewed as less important than restricting.
Yeah.
Than just the outright restriction of everything. So I think it's frustrating that there's little education and guidance on how to do these diets.
Yeah.
Versus just kind of like, oh, here's this list, like good luck, which is generally what I find with practitioners.
Yeah, pretty much.
So, and I think it's so good to point out, like, okay, you can lose tolerance to foods and make the situation so much worse. I even think, like, from my standpoint, restricting too, like, you're losing nutrient diversity as well. Like, usually people are losing, are missing certain vitamins and minerals when they're restricting more. Again, I worry a lot about, like, under eating the more you're restricting. I know we've talked about that, and again, the health of the microbiome, your relationship with food, the stress that causes. Like, there's all these potential factors to weigh into the equation that often are not even discussed. Which, again, I think you should always understand, like, the pros and then the potential cons to doing any diet, and what to look out for if you might need to change something. And having kind of the guidance to help you construct the diet in a way that's going to be less likely to cause any harm. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, like, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it's relevant, is that the mindset of the individual, how do I word this and make it make sense? Okay, so I think that, like, societally, we favor people who are really strict and really, like, go-getters, right? Like, balls to the wall, I'm going to do this 110%. And I think we talked about, like, you can't give 110%, first of all. It's, like, mathematical stupidity to say that. But, our society kind of favors that, like, you know, like, we see the people on Instagram who are beach body model perfect, and they're eating like one leaf of lettuce and one molecule of chicken, and like, you know, 100% organic, and like the kind of like the really strict stuff gets a lot more attention, a lot more likes and clicks and shares. And I think that trickles down. Like I mean, even today, I talked to a lady for like a free, you know, chemistry call kind of thing. And she was like, look, I will do whatever you say. And she even went as far as at one point, she was like, I'm a business owner. My other doctor told me she thinks that a lot of this is stress. Like, if I need to sell my business, I will sell my business and I will get a job. Like, I don't even care. I just want to feel better. And I was like, wow. Like,
Yeah.
on the one hand, awesome. Like, you're dedicated, but also like, whoa, that's like a lot to even think. Let's not go there unless we really, 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 really have to. But I see that like nutritionally is some people are like, what, histamine? Okay, done. And it's like restrict 110%. And it's like this, you know, I can't fall off the diet. I can't fall off the wagon because that would be bad. And in some circumstances, my health coach or my nutritionist or my functional doctor would slap me on the wrist if I ate a tomato. And that would be a bad thing because I have this magical prescribed diet and I'm not allowed to have histamine. These things are off limits. They're illegal. They're bad. So it's like we get these, a lot of people who get really strict and regimented on the histamine thing. And it's almost like no turning back. Like, all right, this is just my diet and I'm going to be ultra perfect for the rest of my life. And that's actually not the best way to be. Again, like depending on, you know, if you have life-threatening level anaphylaxis from eating some of these foods, be smart about it. And maybe you're the exception to what I'm about to say. But for most people, I would argue 99.9% of people who are on the spectrum, even going up into like the mast cell pathology people, I actually want people to be a little bit open-minded to dipping their toe in the water and trying some of these foods again, because it could be that your body has healed or it's changed to a point where you might be really shocked to find one day that you eat some tomato sauce and literally nothing bad happens and you're fine. And like you could live the rest of your life and not know that if you're just terrified of histamine, thinking it's a bad thing, never, ever, ever again. But the people who, frankly, like other practitioners would say that they're not compliant or they're bad patients potentially, or like they would get a slap on the wrist. But like to me, I want people to have that kind of flexibility to say, no, like, and kind of like have the courage to confess it too. Like, yeah, no, I tried tomato sauce the other night. It didn't go well. And I'm like, all right, like, we know that that's still not a thing for you, but you know, in the future, a couple months from now, a year from now, whatever, like try it again, because eventually I would hope that you're going to get to a point where you can eat that high histamine thing. And if you never try it again, you're never going to know. Just be mindful of the dose, because histamine reactions tend to be largely dose dependent, where like maybe you could have like a splash of vinegar and have it not be too bad of an issue. But if you have like, you know, a whole ton of oil and vinegar salad dressing, and some tomato sauce and citrus and whatever, like it'll kind of add up after a point. But a lot of the reactions tend to be at least somewhat dose dependent. So it's like, dip your toe in the water, have half a serving of tomato sauce with your pasta every now and then, see what happens. And then if it's a no-go, then hey, at least you know. But it doesn't have to be this forever super strict 110%, crank it up to 11 kind of a thing, because then you'll never know when you have tolerance again for that food. So I hope that made sense.
And to me, what you're describing sounds a lot like, and I like that too. I find that people that are more flexible tend to do better in general. Like, we can make more changes. We can really hone things to their individual needs. But I think a lot of times what happens is that people are so out of their own bodies too, or don't have any trust in their own bodies and inability to discern what's working and what's not, that again, it leads them to go all in on histamine, all in on low FODMAP. And then it's really hard to break that mindset because there's such little trust in figuring out what works for them. I feel like I experienced that when I went low FODMAP. And I think there's probably a little bit of an anxiety piece too, of like, oh, well, I feel like I can control this aspect, and that helps with my anxiety around food and my anxiety around reactions and things like that. So I do think, like, for my own case and for some of the cases that I work with, sometimes when there's like a lot of control around the diet piece, whether it's histamine or low FODMAP or AIP or whatever it is, where we feel like it has to be super strict, to me it can be very anxiety relieving in a sense, like to have that much control on one area. It's not good. It's not necessarily going to solve the anxiety problem, but I
No.
think usually there's an anxiety piece.
Well, I think anxiety is, like, at its core, anxiety is fear of the future.
Right.
In some way, shape, or form, right? Like, you're
Right.
fearful that this food is going to provoke symptoms for you. You're fearful that this bad thing is going to happen again. This trauma is going to happen again. You're going to be ridiculed. You're going to be laughed at. You're going to be hurt. And it's a normal stress and trauma response that if you have anxiety or
Right.
fear, it's normal for you to want to, like, clamp down on whatever you can control, because then there's fewer scary what ifs. And it's worth mentioning, too, that again, like, not to stereotype all of our listeners, but the people who have histamine issues oftentimes will have anxiety as a piece of that, because keep in mind, histamine is a neurotransmitter. And a piece of it, I find that a lot of my high histamine people also have some anxiety layered in. And how much of that is directly due to the histamine versus, you know, like their health experience and the PTSD of dealing with a health experience. Like, how much of that and how much is, like, kind of their tendency anyway, that's all up for grabs. But I've noticed that a lot of the histamine folk tend to have some anxiety as part of their presentation. So, you know, again, like, that desire to really, like, clamp down can be there. And I've had patients too, like, I remember this one guy, I don't remember his exact symptoms now. It was a couple years ago, but we talked about histamine quite a bit, and he was like, okay, I think I saw him for his second appointment, and I was like, how's the histamine, you know, the food thing going? And he was like, oh, it's fine. And he was like, I eat the same thing for breakfast, the same thing for lunch, the same thing for dinner. He literally had his 3 staple meals, and that was it. But he was good with it. He was like, yeah, I'm happy with that. Like, I like all those meals. I can eat them forever. No problem. I'm good. And I was like, let's talk about that a little bit more. But he was like, no, done. All, you know, everything that needs to be controlled was controlled. Everything's good. I'm good. And I was like, I had to kind of rein it back in a little bit and be like, well, but you can't eat the same exact thing every day. Because again, you're going to lose tolerance to the world, and your microbiome's going to go out the door. And it's not going to do good things for your long-term healing. Even though, you know, at least in America, we tend to see cooking as a chore. And it's a thing that, like, oh, you what is it? Eat to live, not live to eat. Like, oh, I have to eat in order to survive because, like, my stupid body needs fuel. So whatever, I guess I'll just cook. And it's like, if we could simplify that and dummy it down to, like, 3 meals that you have to cook for the rest of your life, some people find that really appealing. But it's not a solution. It's not, like, that's not how you run a healthy body, even if it is an effective Band-Aid for a period of time. Like, you do need to focus on getting some nutrition and, like, branching out at least a bit if you want to actually heal what's going on, that is.
Right. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Yeah, I think it's such a balance, like balancing the mindset piece. And I think working with someone's so important that kind of understands the mindset piece too, just because if you're in your own head, it's hard to, like, get outside of yourself and see the situation clearly. Yeah. And I think I definitely sort of relate to the anxiety and the control aspect of as someone that's probably struggled with some disordered eating patterns when I had my own SIBO situation. I think it's easy to sort of want that control, and it's hard to break out of that too. And I think it really just comes down to, like, training yourself to learn how to trust your body and working on that sort of stuff. And it's definitely, again, histamine is the same in the same realm of that, where, like you were saying before, it can be very dose dependent. So even getting a sense of, like, oh, I can have this much vinegar but not that much vinegar, or this much I can reincorporate this much tomato sauce, but if I ate more than that, that'd be really problematic. Or I have to steer clear of this food forever because I just know I don't do well with it, versus you just kind of staying completely off all high histamine foods or all medium
just
histamine
forever.
Foods forever. So I think really being able to hone in on what your body's saying. And I think that's a process too. A lot of times when people try something and it's going well, that's obviously great because it builds confidence. But I also think sometimes when people try stuff and they're like, oh, I tried this and it didn't go well, like you were describing, like someone trying something and it not going well. Sometimes how I'll help them reframe it is say like, oh, well, at least you know now that like that's something that just isn't, you're not ready for at this moment. But you know that based on how you listening to your body, versus like you didn't know that until you tried it. And I'm sure there's going to be foods that you are surprised that you respond well to. So again, sometimes reframing that too, if something doesn't necessarily go as planned or as you would have hoped for, to even be proud of yourself for trying it and learning that, oh, it doesn't work. I guess I have that data point now. Yeah. Because that gets you closer to finding the pieces and aspects of your diet that do work.
Yeah. And again, like, your body will change over time.
Right.
For the better, for the worse. Like, and it's capable of a lot more than we give it credit for. Like, even for me, honestly, when I, was working on my gut a lot and I discovered like the celiac thing, the dairy intolerance, and at the time, sesame was also like my kryptonite. Like, I actually said at one point, I would rather get exposed to gluten than sesame because my reaction to sesame was more severe than gluten, and I'm a damn celiac. So I remember like being just really like pregnant, bloated, a lot of pain, horrible diarrhea, and just like really, really sick from freaking sesame seeds. And they're, especially in the beginning when my reaction was so severe and I saw it, on black and white paper, I got food sensitivity testing done and that like proved it to me. And at the time in particular, like going to seminars and functional medicine classes, it was like, oh, you have food sensitivity? Never again. Off the table forever. And so I very much believed, I don't think I could heal that. Like, I think that gluten, dairy, and sesame are just my 3 things I could never eat again. Period. End of story. And I didn't try it for many years. And then I accidentally got exposed to sesame at a vegan restaurant. And I had no idea. It was like 5 years later. And I didn't find out even the day of. It was like the next week I went to meet somebody else at that same restaurant. And I ordered a thing and I mentioned sesame. And the guy was like, oh, well, you know that such and such has tahini in it, right? I was like, really? And there was almost like a little bit of panic. Like, oh my God. But then I realized, wait, you bonehead, you ate it. Like, you ate the whole thing last week and literally nothing happened. Huh. So I actually got brave enough to try sesame a couple times after that. Like, I ate the same dish that had tahini in it and I was fine. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna get something that like my brain really wraps its head around. So the next time I got falafels that had sesame seeds like crusted on the outside of the falafel, and that I actually had to do some deep breathing before I ate those. I remember I was at the restaurant with my mom and I was like, all right, I'm just going to close my eyes for a minute. Bear with me. And I had to do deep breathing because like just the visual of the sesame seeds, I was like, all right, man, this is getting really real. Yeah. And I felt like that kind of stress response kicking in where I was really fearful of the food, even though I knew that I had eaten tahini paste twice with no issue. Right. I was feeling really fearful of the food, and I knew that if I was feeling fearful and then I ate that damn food, it would not sit well with me. Right? Because like I taught my body that it was going to be a scary thing. So I had to sit there with my eyes closed in the restaurant for like a good minute or two, doing some deep breathing, telling myself it's going to be okay. You've had sesame recently. And I ate those falafels crusted in sesame seeds. Not a damn thing happened. I was like, okay. And now to be clear, like I'm still a little bit of a wuss. So I don't eat sesame all the time because I don't want to piss off my celiac disease, or I have antibodies for a type of autoimmune diabetes and I don't want to lose my pancreas. Like I like my pancreas. Yeah. So like I don't want to piss off my autoimmunity and poke the bear, but I basically, it's like 2 or 3 times a year when we go to a Mediterranean restaurant and I want like the falafels with a tahini dip sauce or something that has sesame seeds on it, like 2 or 3 times a year now, I will splurge and I'll have tahini or sesame seeds, and it doesn't do a damn thing to me. And I'm like, all right, this is my happy place. I don't need to eat it all the time. I still make, my husband or I makes hummus at home. So we make hummus without tahini paste. And like, that's kind of, I stay away from it normally, but by God, if I go to a Mediterranean restaurant and I want to get that tahini dip, now I have the ability to do so. But I never thought I'd be able to.
Yeah.
And I would have wussed out. I never would have even tried if it wasn't for the fact that I accidentally got exposed to the stuff. And it was like a week or two later that I found out. It gave me the bravery to try it. But, like kind of using what I said as an example, if you never dip your toe in the water with something that's like a sensitivity or a histamine response or a FODMAP or whatever, there could be years or decades of your life where you could have been eating your equivalent of sesame.
Right.
And you would have been fine. And you missed out on that. So every now and then, again, as long as you don't have like scary anaphylactic reactions, and as long as you don't have like celiac disease, like if you're a celiac, don't try gluten every couple of months. Like that's dumb. Like that's just a never again thing.
Right.
But shy of like life-threatening levels of stuff, even if it's like once every 5 years, that's better than nothing. Like even schedule it in, like pencil it in your Google Calendar and be like, oh, this is the year I try tomatoes again or whatever it might be. But like have that flexibility to think that, weirder things have happened. Maybe I can tolerate this someday. And I just need to give my body some space to heal and have confidence in its ability to heal. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I had a similar, I feel like, situation when I was going through, not necessarily low FODMAP, but like, I'm just going to be dairy free forever. I'm just going to be gluten free forever. I'm just going to be, egg free. Like, like all like the common allergens, I feel like I went down the rabbit hole. At this point, again, I eat dairy pretty regularly. Gluten I can eat in really small amounts and do just fine. But I'm not celiac, so I wouldn't advise, like what you said, for someone with celiac to kind of dabble with gluten.
Yeah, don't dabble, guys.
Don't
not
dabble
if you're a celiac.
Gluten. But yeah, I think it's so important to recognize that, like, what's good for you in this moment might not be what's good for you 6 months down the line, a year down the line, 2 years down the line. Things change all the time, and even your needs will change, even from a calorie standpoint. So I think it's just always important to know that, to have that mental flexibility to think, oh, I could actually try that again someday, and I'm open to that idea, versus being so strict or having like this mindset that that's not a possibility at all, when it could very much be a possibility. Yeah, it's oftentimes, it's a matter of time. Like I said, there was 5 years where I didn't touch a sesame seed. At least, I mean, it might have been 6, I don't know, but there was a good chunk of time where it was just, that was not a thing. End of story, period. So it could be even, maybe it takes you years to get something back in your diet, but have like that one neuron in your brain that's optimistic that maybe that could happen. Right? But all right, so let's talk about the histamine food kind of spectrum for a little bit, and then I think we will have covered most of the things. This is, I don't know if you've seen this too, but there are, I would estimate 37,000 lists for histamine food lists on the internet. They're all different, and it makes you want to gouge your eye out with a pencil. So you go and you look at like the Mast Cell Foundation of, I don't even know, I'm making it up. Like you look at one website and you look at like the low histamine chef's website, and you look at Joe Schmo, functional medicine doctor in God knows where's website. You look at all of these different resources and they're all different. So I'll start by saying that we see that too. There are a million of them. It's not as easy to measure histamine in food as it is like a FODMAP. Yeah.
So like, Monash University, like they have like labs and stuff, and they're like measuring the grams of the FODMAP fiber in the foods. They've got it down to a science. Histamine, it's not the most stable molecule, and freshness is very much an influencer. So like fresh meat versus leftover meat, or the ripeness of a fruit or vegetable is going to influence it. Who knows? Maybe like where it was grown might even have an influence on it. Like Lord only knows. So there's a lot of variation in the histamine list. So ultimately, this is going to be a situation where you need to use something as a starting template and then kind of like try some stuff out and see what happens. And a lot of the histamine lists become confusing also because a lot of them will be hybrid lists where it's a combination of histamine containing foods and mast cell degranulators or allergens. So it's like, you know, my understanding at least is that like egg whites, for example, will show up on a lot of lists. It's not that egg whites are intrinsically high in histamine, but apparently they're a common allergen and mast cell degranulator. So it's going to make your immune system release its own histamine. That's my understanding of it, at least.
Yeah.
Versus like strawberries randomly actually contain histamine. And like meat, especially leftover meat and seafood, contains actual histamine. So there's kind of like there's two lists that are getting folded together most of the time. And it's hard to pick apart like what things contain histamine versus what is a mast cell triggering thing. So just I want to acknowledge that the list thing is really confusing. I've made one that I give out to my patients. I'll put it on my website. I'll just put it as like a blog, like Infinity Holistic Health /histamine. And I'll just make sure the URL for that blog post is just histamine. So you could download that, and I have my anti-histamine food list. So like the things that are high in like quercetin and luteolin that you can add to your diet. But that being said, Amy, if you were to name, you know, a handful of foods that are like very high histamine, rattle some off for us, and then we'll talk about like the highs and the lows and some of what we see on these lists.
Yeah, I would say I would think about some categories. I think about it kind of in categories a little bit. So like fermented foods can be high histamine. Yep. Usually dried foods are going to be higher in histamine. Things like canned foods are going to be higher in histamine. Tomatoes, which we've mentioned, going to be higher in histamine. Citrus, I would say, is another one. Yep. Those are kind of the biggies, and vinegars and things like that too. Yeah. Which I guess those are anything aged. I would think. Yeah. You know, aged and fermented in some way.
Yeah, like aged and pickled and
canned
smoked.
And, yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, smoked meats or even like processed meats.
Like jerkies and...
Yeah, that sort of stuff tends to be high. To go with the tomatoes, oftentimes peppers are fairly high. I don't know. I really have to survey some of my mast cell patients. I don't truly know if white potatoes are a histamine thing. Hold on, let me look at one of my lists real quick. I don't remember now. I don't know if it's truly all of the nightshades. Yeah. Or if it's just, or if potatoes end up being okay. I feel like the potatoes end up being okay for most people, but I'll have to double check. Let's see. Yeah, sweet potatoes, fine. Let's see, where is just a potato, though? Hold on, looking at my list. Yeah, potatoes appear to be okay. So for the record, like the tomato, pepper kind of thing, it doesn't appear to be all nightshades. This appears to be a bit different because it looks like potatoes and sweet potatoes make it on the okay list, from what I can tell. Yeah. Again, like listen to your body. Zucchini also appears to be fine, so I wouldn't sweat zucchini. I think zucchini is a nightshade, isn't it? I forget now. But yeah, the tomatoes, peppers. Another one that I see moderately frequently is tree nuts. Mm-hmm. So like, you know, why am I having a brain fart? What is a tree nut, Amy?
Like a
example,
like
walnuts.
Walnut. Like I think
pecans. I don't know why that was so hard.
Coconut's considered a tree nut, I think.
Yeah, let me look at my list again. Maybe I'm just gonna keep this up now.
One of my really good friends is allergic to tree nuts, which is weird.
Hazelnuts.
Yep.
Hazelnuts, filberts. Hold on, I'm gonna look for freaking coconuts.
Pecans one, right?
Yep. Pecan. Do you say pecans, not pecans?
I don't know. I say pecans.
I don't know what I say anymore.
I say pecans, but I think, did you say pecans? I don't know.
I would say pecan. Yeah, which is funny because then it conjures an image of a can full of pea. But I think I grew up saying pecan, and I like now I laugh at myself. Now.
Just
Yeah, because it makes you think
and
of
I
canned
really
pea.
want to emphasize the P.
Yeah, it's a pecan.
P.
Yeah, I think I almost wish that I grew up saying it as pecan. Like it sounds more beautiful
Yeah.
to say pecan, but no, I think pecan. What's another one? I was just thinking of another funny little pronunciation thing the other day, and I was like, why do we say that? I'll think of it later. I can't for the life of me find coconut on here. You're right, coconut is a tree nut technically.
Yeah.
I don't see it showing up on my lists anywhere, so that's like a questionable one to me. I don't know. I feel like a lot of my histamine people actually do okay with coconut. Again, I'll have to send out like an email survey to my mast cell patients or something, and kind of get their feedback on it. But I haven't had a lot of people talk about coconut. I've had a lot of people talk about vinegar, and a lot of people talk about the citrus and the tomatoes.
Yeah.
The tree nuts. Like there's some pretty classic things.
One too.
Citrus.
I think chocolate's another one that I hear sometimes too.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes chocolate's an issue. There's also like the wild card of any sort of like additive can be kind of a wild card for a lot of people, because again, I think it's not that additives, like sulfates and nitrates and that sort of stuff, I don't think they contain histamine, but they're things that will instigate an immune response and make the immune system go wackadoo. And then if the immune system goes wackadoo, then it produces histamine. So if you're like a hyperallergic person and then you ingest something like carrageenan or a nitrate or something like that, like it's just kind of a wild card what your immune system is going to do about that. But theoretically, any sort of like funky additives and emulsifiers and food dyes and food coloring, like that stuff can be kind of a question mark for a lot of mast cell people. I think we've covered a lot of the big guys though. Like certainly, the preserved, fermented, smoked, etc. kind of foods are a really big biggie. Meat and seafood is a really weird one because if you eat it fresh, it's usually fine. Like you could eat a steak or a chicken or a fish or whatever if you cook it up and then you eat it right away. But if you cook like a big batch of chicken and then you put the leftovers in the fridge and then you eat leftovers the following day and then the day after that, like each time you eat it, you're going to have more of a histamine buildup because the amino acids in that animal protein actually degrade from histidine to histamine, and it's actually building up histamine as time goes on. So meat is kind of a weird one because like, I've had patients tell me, and this can happen for other reasons too, but I've had people tell me like, yeah, like I can't pick up on a pattern. It's really weird because like one day I eat chicken and I'm fine. And then the next day I eat chicken, the exact same thing. And then I get a reaction. So like, what's going on? Like, was it the chicken? And sometimes there's other factors like, all right, the day that you had the reaction, were you also like hella stressed?
Right.
Or did you get rotten sleep? Like, what was your body up to on both of those days? And were you more like vulnerable the second day? Or was it something like a histamine, like the food actually changed and you didn't realize it changed because it's microscopic and like you weren't aware of the histamine buildup thing? But yeah, meat and seafood is kind of a funny one. What I'll say too is that it's counterintuitive, but when I say that the meat and seafood should be fresh, I don't mean go to the meat counter of your grocery store, holler at me if you go to Wegmans. Don't go to the meat counter at Wegmans or the seafood counter at Wegmans and buy like the ready to cook thing. Like you're actually better off getting the frozen meat or the frozen seafood because most often, but the quote unquote fresh meat at a grocery store, even if it was butchered like 2 days ago, it's got to be like butchered and cut up and shipped and packaged and like unpacked and put in the case. And like by the time the meat gets to the case, it's actually been out for at least a day or two.
Yeah.
Which isn't bad for most people, but for people with histamine stuff, the day or two can make or break the deal here. Versus if a farmer or a company knows that they're immediately going to freeze the food, or if the farmer knows like, oh, we're going to slaughter all of our animals, in this particular week, and then we're going to freeze everything, then literally like the slaughtering happened, and then within like an hour or two, it got
Right.
frozen. So the frozen food can actually be more fresh, ironically, even though it feels like you're getting the fresh thing at the meat counter. And then the same thing with seafood. Like if they know that they're going to sell it as like frozen tilapia or frozen salmon, that it's just going to be in the supermarket freezer aisle, they will prep the fish and like freeze it on the boat sometimes. It doesn't even make it all the way to shore. But the actual like cold but not frozen fish had to be, it was caught, it was stored down below in the ship, it was driven in or whatever to the dock, put on a truck, the truck got to your grocery store, like that took time. So you actually are better off getting meat and seafood if you can get it frozen, like buying frozen beef or chicken directly from the farmer. For example, that's a great way to get frozen meat, or getting frozen seafood from the freezer section and those little stupid like zipper pouch or like, freezer bird resistant pouch things, like the individual servings of salmon or whatever. That's actually better for histamine purposes rather than going up to the meat counter or the seafood counter. So that's worthy of knowing too.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think again, like with the meat side of things, I think you're right. Like there's definitely people that are sensitive to the leftover situation from a histamine standpoint. Like the fresher the better in those situations,
especially with meat and seafood.
Yeah,
leftover veggies usually isn't that big of a deal from what I can gather. Like if you make a big batch of broccoli and then you eat the leftover broccoli the next day, that seems to go okay. But it's like the leftover meat and seafood. But what you could do too, and I'm glad that I remember this too, is that you could still do batch cooking. It's just kind of a weird kind of situation because you do say that you cook like 8 chicken breasts all at once. You grill them all up. They're beautiful. They're amazing. Wait for them to cool down, slap them in a container or wrap them up in foil or something, and then put them in the freezer and just freeze them. And then as dumb as it sounds and as dumb as it feels, you can go in the freezer the next day, take out one of those, fillets or whatever that you cooked, thaw it in the microwave or thaw it, for half an hour or something, and then reheat it. And then you could eat the leftovers next day, but like freeze it in between. Because when you freeze the meat, it halts that degradation of the histidine into histamine. And then you're stopping that process, so it keeps it fresher. So it's dumb, but like cook in the big batch, slap it all in the freezer, and then pull it out when you need it, even if it is the next day, and you're going to have less of a histamine burden because of that.
Yeah.
So.
For sure. No, I think that's a great point. And I know we talked about last time, too, potentially using something like a DAO to help with your meals and help with the histamine load that's in the food. I think can be a useful tool for some. I feel like some people just love DAO, and then others are like, it was okay. But I think in those situations, maybe there's just a lot of inflammation and histamine being released, that even with DAO, they're going to react to any kind of bits of food that are moderate to high in histamine.
The people who don't have much of a response from DAO, I think, okay, leaky gut isn't the biggest driving piece for you.
Yeah.
But the people who they take, 2 capsules of DAO and they're like, oh, I can eat tomatoes again. This is amazing. I'm like, oh, okay, you have leaky gut.
Right.
That's a slam dunk. You probably have mad leaky gut and you weren't producing enough DAO because your brush border is trashed.
Right.
And now it's kind of nice because a response to that supplement gives us a really clear indication of something we could work on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you thought DAO was a miracle, then work on your leaky gut. If not, maybe there's other fish to fry. Maybe there's more of the immune system wonkiness, loss of tolerance. Maybe leaky gut is part of it, but it's not the whole thing. Maybe you have SIBO, candida, dysbiosis, whatever it might be. But you can kind of rule in leaky gut with that trial, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
Yeah. Pro tip with Dr. Danessa.
What else? Do we have anything else?
I don't know. I feel like we've hit all the things. Again, it was nice to break this one into 2 episodes because we covered a lot of the mast cell immunology piece of it last time, and then today was much more focused on the food thing. I feel like we hit all the high points here.
Yeah.
Like I said, acknowledging all the lists are different. It's really frustrating. Just above all else, listen to your body. But I'll put my list and my antihistamine food list out there for you. So it'll be Infinity Holistic Health /histamine. So you could download both of those. Just, go into it knowing that unless you have like really overt pathology, like confirmed diagnosed mast cell disease, there's a high likelihood that you can get a lot of these foods back in your diet. It's just a matter of when. And like have that as your background, like thing that you want to do, like have that on your radar, and then it's just a matter of when, not a matter of if. But yeah, I think restricting high histamine foods for a while can be really borderline miraculous for some people. So if you think, if the profile of the person I described fits you, if you are a phlegmy, mucus factory, itchy, eczema-ish, hive-ish, asthma-ish, allergic person who has all the food sensitivities and allergies and environmental allergies, and you're just like buckets of boogers, check it out, because I think it might be really, really impactful for you to reduce the histamine load that you're experiencing. And then certainly trying to understand the root causes would be helpful. If that whole description doesn't resonate quite as much with you, then maybe, see you in the next podcast episode. And maybe it's not quite as big of a deal for you, but there are many of us histamitic people out in the universe. So I hope that they all get a chance to hear our really amazing advice, because let's face it, we're pretty brill. Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Amy?
Nothing to add of value, except I've never heard the expression buckets of boogers, but
I think I'm going to coin it. I'll make a t-shirt with that, with a big old bucket of boogers.
It's really painting a weird picture in my head.
It does. Yeah. It's,
cool.
They're my people, the mucus factories.
Yeah.
They're my people. Yeah, I think that's it. Well, we're going to wrap up on buckets of boogers, guys.
Yeah.
So I hope that this podcast finds the right ears and eyeballs if you're on YouTube. Hi, if you're on YouTube. But yeah, I mean, per our usual, we would love to hear from you. So if you could go ahead and rate us 5 stars in your app store, like, comment, ring the bell, do whatever, comment down below if you're on YouTube. We would love to hear from you and reach out. In the future, we are going to do a listener questions episode. So I've got my assistant combing through and looking for some questions from our YouTube channel, for example. And we're going to go over some questions at some point in the near future. So if you have questions, pop them in the doobly-doo down below on YouTube, and we'll check that out. And we'll see you in the next episode. Until next time, I bid you adieu, fair Amy. I bid you adieu.
See you later, Nikki.
Bye.